Welcome to today's deep dive. Before we even pull back the curtain on today's material, I just want to warmly receive you into this space. I want to offer a divine blessing for your day and for your entire week ahead. May your path be leveled. May your mind find clarity in all the noise. And may you experience a really profound sense of peace and purpose in whatever you are stepping into today.
Thank you for that. That is really a brilliant way to ground us.
Yeah.
Especially considering the sheer gravity of the historical and theological narrative we're about to pull apart.
Yeah, we really are stepping into something massive today. For this deep dive, we are zeroing in on Genesis chapter 16. And to guide our analysis, we have extracted the most crucial notes, the cultural context, and theological insights from two highly respected and comprehensive study Bibles.
Right, the Holman Study Bible and the Nova Almeida Actualizada, or the NAA.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack a story of profound human impatience, ancient cultural workarounds, and a completely unprecedented encounter between a marginalized, discarded servant and the divine. Okay, let's unpack this.
To understand this story, we have to look beyond our modern perspective and dive into the cultural realities of the ancient Near East. If we superimpose 21st century morality or, our modern legal frameworks onto this narrative, we are going to completely miss the actual weight of the history.
We'd miss the whole point.
Exactly. And worse, we will miss the absolute shock of what transpires out in the wilderness later on.
So let's bypass the Sunday school basics because you, listening to this, you likely already know the foundational setup here. We are looking at Abram and Sarai.
Right.
And they have been living in the land of Canaan for 10 years. 10 years of wandering, setting up tents, and waiting on a very specific covenant promise that they would have an heir.
10 years is a long time to wait for a promise.
It really is. And time is relentlessly ticking. Sarai is 75 years old. Abram is 85. I mean, the biological window hasn't just closed, it's been boarded up and painted over.
And in their specific historical context, a lack of an heir was not just it wasn't just a private emotional sorrow, it was a structural crisis.
How so?
Well, in the ancient Near East, your lineage was essentially your retirement plan, your Social Security, and your legal protection all rolled into one.
Wow.
Yeah, the capacity to bear children was the ultimate measure of worth and security for a woman in that era. So the tension in that camp must have been suffocating. Sarai decides she can no longer wait for the supernatural. She needs to engineer a practical solution to resolve her sterility.
Which brings us to the surrogate plan. Sarai approaches Abram and essentially offers her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to her husband to conceive a child.
Yes.
Now, a modern reader immediately recoils at this. It sounds chaotic, deeply unethical, and fraught with obvious boundary issues. But pulling from the historical context we extracted from our sources, this wasn't actually a scandalous, illicit affair, was it?
Not at all. Both sets of study notes are incredibly clear on this point. In the ancient world, what Sarai proposed was a perfectly legal, heavily documented, and widely accepted custom.
Really? Widely accepted?
Absolutely. We see this in ancient legal codes from the entire region. A barren wife could legally offer her servant to her husband to secure a legitimate heir for the family. The legal fiction of the day dictated that the child born to the servant would be officially counted as the wife's child.
So it's a loophole.
Exactly. Sarai is essentially utilizing the standard, socially acceptable legal loophole of her era to force the fulfillment of a divine promise.
She is tired of waiting for the package to arrive, so she's trying to hack the delivery system.
That is a great way to put it.
And let's look at Hagar for a moment. The Holman notes suggest she was likely acquired earlier, back when Abram and Sarai were living in Egypt. She is a foreigner, she's property, and the notes suggest she may have been quite young.
Perhaps just an adolescent.
Right. She has zero agency in this transaction. But before we judge Sarai too harshly, I want to hold a mirror up to us for a second. How often do we do the exact same thing? We get exhausted waiting for a breakthrough, a promise, or a change in our circumstances, and we default to forcing a human solution. We just grab the wheel.
It is the most natural human reflex to want to help God out when the timeline doesn't match our expectations. But the theological parallels our sources draw here are chilling.
The Eden connection.
Yes. The study notes heavily link Sarai, offering Hagar to Abram, to the events in the Garden of Eden, specifically Genesis chapter 3, verse 6.
Oh, that is a fascinating connection. Walk us through how those two moments mirror each other.
Think about the mechanics of the scene in Eden. You have the wife, Eve, taking matters into her own hands, grasping at something that seems like a good shortcut to wisdom and divine status, but is ultimately unauthorized.
She grabs fruit.
Right, she offers it to her husband. And what does Adam do? He doesn't seek divine guidance. He doesn't protect his family. He passively accepts it and eats.
He just goes along with it.
Fast forward to Genesis 16. Sarai grasps at a legal shortcut to secure her legacy, offers the tempting but disastrous solution to Abram, and Abram's response is identical to Adam's.
Absolute passivity.
Absolute passivity.
That's
He
right.
just goes along with the plan. He completely abdicates his leadership.
And the fallout is almost instantaneous. Abram agrees, he sleeps with Hagar, and she quickly conceives. And the moment that pregnancy is confirmed, the entire social and power dynamic of their sprawling camp completely fractures.
Because the legal reality collides with the biological and psychological reality.
What do you mean by that?
Legally, Hagar's status is subtly elevated. She's no longer just a servant, she is a secondary wife. But culturally, she has just achieved the one thing her incredibly wealthy, powerful mistress could not. She is carrying the patriarch's heir. She holds the ultimate trump card in that society.
The text notes that Hagar begins to look upon Sarai with contempt. You can practically feel the toxicity in the air.
Oh, absolutely.
You have a pregnant, likely adolescent servant who has just been elevated in status looking down her nose at her 75-year-old barren mistress. Sarai's legal maneuver completely backfired. She tried to secure her position and ended up creating a rival who despises her.
Which leads to a wildly modern-feeling domestic dispute. Sarai is furious, she's humiliated and deeply insecure. And in a classic display of human nature, she absolutely refuses to take responsibility for the catastrophe she architected.
Right. She storms up to Abram and essentially says, "My wrong be upon you."
It's the ultimate ancient blame game.
She hands him this terrible idea, watches it blow up in her face, and then points the finger at him like, "I cannot believe you let me do this to myself." It would be almost comical if the stakes weren't so high. How does Abram handle the confrontation?
With staggering cowardice. He completely washes his hands of this situation. He tells Sarai, "Your servant is in your hands. Do to her whatever you think is best."
He legally downgrades her again.
Yes, he legally downgrades Hagar back to the sole authority of Sarai. He fails to protect the young woman carrying his own child, fails to mediate the conflict, and just retreats to avoid his wife's wrath.
That dynamic highlights a brilliant synthesis from the Nova Almeida Actualizada research notes regarding how the Old Testament handles these types of situations. We see polygamy, or the taking of multiple wives and concubines, quite a bit in the biblical narrative. It's easy for a modern reader to assume the text is endorsing the practice.
That is a crucial misconception to clear up. One of the most fascinating takeaways from our deep dive into these study notes is a distinct pattern. Whenever the biblical text records instances of polygamy, it is never presented as a blueprint for human flourishing.
It's more of a warning label.
Exactly. The text is brutally honest about the immense complications, the bitter jealousy, the fractured households, and the profound trauma that inevitably follows. It isn't endorsing the cultural norm, it is exposing its deep flaws. This entire mess is the direct result of using human maneuvering to bypass a divine waiting period.
And the resulting havoc falls hardest on the person with the least amount of power. Sarai uses the disciplinary authority Abram just handed back to her to, as the text puts it, afflict Hagar.
She severely mistreats her.
She humiliates her. The environment becomes so abusive and unbearable that Hagar makes a desperate choice. She runs.
Fleeing into the ancient Near Eastern wilderness is essentially a death sentence, especially for a pregnant woman traveling entirely alone on foot. The climate is unforgiving, the terrain is brutal, and water is scarce.
The sources track her geographical movements, which tells us a lot about her state of mind. She is found by a spring of water on the way to shore.
Right, and Shur is the desert region bordering Egypt.
She is desperately trying to walk back to her homeland. She is retreating to the only place she knows, trying to escape the unbearable toxic reality of Canaan. She's sitting by a well, exhausted, terrified, and totally out of options.
And this is exactly where the narrative aggressively shifts from a messy domestic dispute into something profoundly supernatural. Because out there, in the absolute middle of nowhere, Hagar is met by a figure identified as the angel of the Lord.
Let's put a pin in the narrative right here and unpack the theological weight of this figure, because both study Bibles spend significant time debating the identity of this specific angel, who is actually showing up in the desert.
It is one of the most compelling debates in biblical scholarship. The text deliberately blurs the lines of identity here. Some scholars argue this is simply a heavenly messenger, an angel speaking in the first person as a proxy on God's behalf. But a very prominent view, highlighted by our sources, is that this is a Christophany.
A Christophany. For anyone not familiar with the theological jargon, break that down for us.
A Christophany is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. Think of it like a famous movie director making a subtle cameo in their own film long before they officially introduce themselves as the main character.
I love that analogy.
The way the narrative unfolds, the angel doesn't just deliver a message from God. The angel's voice is treated interchangeably with the direct voice of God himself. The authority is absolute and innate.
That changes the framing entirely. This isn't just an intern delivering a memo. This is the author of the story stepping into the dirt with a runaway slave. And the first thing this divine figure does is issue a remarkably difficult command. The angel tells Hagar to return to her mistress and submit to her authority.
It is a staggering directive.
Let's push on that a bit, because to a modern listener, that sounds incredibly problematic. Why on earth would a benevolent God intercept an abused, pregnant teenager in the desert, only to command her to march right back to her abuser? Does the text give us any clue as to why that specific submission was necessary?
It is arguably one of the hardest commands for modern readers to digest. But the context provided by our sources is essential here. This command wasn't about endorsing Sarai's abusive behavior. Sarai is actually held accountable in the broader narrative. This is about a necessary internal transformation for Hagar.
How so?
Remember the psychological shift we discussed earlier? Hagar had allowed her pregnancy to fill her with pride, contempt, and arrogance toward her mistress.
Right, she became haughty.
Exactly. The NABA note suggests she had internalized the toxic power dynamics of Canaan. Submitting her pride was a required step for her to receive the blessing properly. She couldn't walk into her destiny carrying the arrogance she had developed in Abram's tent.
That makes sense.
But crucially, and this changes everything, God does not just send her back with a harsh, arbitrary rule. He pairs this difficult command with an immediate, overwhelming demonstration of grace and a foundational promise.
He doesn't send her back empty-handed. The angel promises to multiply her descendants so greatly that they will be uncountable. He tells her she is going to have a son, and she is explicitly instructed to name him Ishmael.
The naming is vital. Ishmael translates to God hears.
God hears. Not God commands or God punishes. God hears. He heard the cries she stifled when she was being mistreated in the camp, and he heard her weeping in despair out in the desert.
It is a permanent, biological monument to divine empathy. Every time she calls her son's name for the rest of her life, she's declaring that the divine listened to the agony of a slave. And the angel continues with a highly specific prophecy about who this boy, Ishmael, will become. The text says he will be a wild donkey of a man.
Okay, to our modern ears, calling a pregnant mother's unborn child a wild donkey sounds like a bizarre, almost comical insult.
It really does. But the experts clarify that in the ancient context, specifically referring to the Asiatic wild ass or onager, this is actually a powerful badge of honor.
A badge of honor.
Yes. The wild donkey was known to be incredibly strong, fiercely independent, and capable of thriving in the harshest desert environments. It could never be broken to the plow.
That is profound. It's a prophetic promise that her son will never be subjugated. He will never be a servant like his mother was. He will roam freely.
Precisely. However, the prophecy is also brutally realistic. It notes that his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward his brothers. It is a complex destiny, great freedom and untamable strength, but marked by perpetual conflict.
As striking as that prophecy is, Hagar's response to this entire encounter is what truly stops you in your tracks. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
Hagar, an Egyptian, a woman, a foreigner, a runaway servant, does something that absolutely no one else in the entire biblical narrative does. She assigns a name to God.
It is a structural and theological earthquake in the text. The Holman notes emphasize just how staggering this breach of ancient protocol truly is.
Break that down for us.
In ancient Near Eastern and Asiatic customs, the act of naming something or renaming someone was exclusively reserved for the person who held authority over the one being named. You named your livestock, you named your children. A conquering king would rename a captured vassal. Naming implied ownership and dominion.
So for a runaway, marginalized slave to look at the creator of the cosmos and essentially say, I'm going to give you a name, that could easily be interpreted as highly presumptuous, if not outright blasphemous.
It completely upends the cosmic hierarchy. And the staggering part is that God doesn't strike her down. He doesn't correct her. He accepts the name. He allows this discarded teenager to memorialize his character.
And the name she chooses is breathtaking. She calls him Elroy, which translates to, "You are the God who sees me," or, more intimately, the God of seeing. She's standing by that spring, marveling at the sheer impossibility that she just witnessed a manifestation of the divine and survived it. But deeper than that, she grasps a theological truth that the patriarchs back in the camp seem to have missed.
Exactly. The angel told her that God hears her affliction, but Hagar realizes that God doesn't just hear the noise of her pain from a distance. He sees her. He perceives her humanity. It is the difference between an emergency dispatcher hearing your call and a first responder actually showing up at your location, looking you in the eye, and pulling you out of the wreckage. Elroy, the God who sees.
I really want to bridge this ancient moment directly to you, the listener, right now. We live in an era characterized by overwhelming information, digital noise, and billions of people constantly shouting to be noticed. It is incredibly easy to feel entirely invisible, to feel like a metric, a demographic, or someone who simply slipped through the cracks of a busy world.
So true.
The concept presented in this ancient text of a divine being who bypasses kings and patriarchs, stops the machinery of the universe, looks directly at the lowest, most discarded, culturally invisible person in that society and says, "I see you," it is staggering.
It dismantles the power structures of the ancient world. Think about the contrast. The elite, the wealthy, the chosen patriarch and matriarch, they are back in their comfortable tents, making an absolute mess of their divine calling through impatience and cruelty. But the true, direct, and intimate divine revelation happens out in the dirt, in the desolate wilderness, to the runaway victim of their scheme.
And that location becomes a geographical memorial. The well where this incredible exchange takes place is forever named Bir Lahai Roy, which translates to "Well of the Living One Who Sees Me." It becomes a permanent marker of God's intimate care for the marginalized.
Armed with this massive promise and a completely transformed understanding of who God is, Hagar makes an agonizing choice. She obeys. She turns her back on the road to Egypt, and she walks all the way back to Abram's camp in Canaan.
We have to pause and acknowledge the sheer psychological fortitude that must have required. She has to walk right back into the tension, back to the mistress who abused her, back to the man who abandoned her.
It's incredibly brave.
But this time, she isn't walking back as a discarded piece of property. She is walking back carrying a divine promise and carrying the unshakable knowledge that she is seen by Elroy.
Her internal reality has fundamentally shifted, and when she arrives, she clearly tells Abram exactly what happened out by that spring. We know this because of how the narrative handles the birth. When Hagar finally gives birth to the boy, it is Abram, acting as the patriarch, who officially names him Ishmael.
Which is massive validation. By naming him Ishmael, the exact name the angel instructed Hagar to use Abram is publicly validating her unbelievable story. He is officially recognizing the boy as his son and his heir, in accordance with the divine command she received. He doesn't dismiss her wilderness encounter, he adopts it.
It is a moment of order being restored from the chaos of their human impatience. And the text stamps this concluding moment with a very specific timeline. Abram's 86 years old when Ishmael was born.
Meaning it has been exactly 11 years since he first arrived in Canaan. He was 75 when he got there. He waited 10 years. The catastrophic surrogate plan unfolded. Hagar fled, and now he is 86. The waiting for the original specific promise involving Sarai will continue for over a decade more, but this profound chapter of Hagar's story concludes with the birth of the son, whose name means God hears.
Pulling all these narrative threads together, the contrast we've explored in this deep dive is striking. On one side of the ledger, you have Sarai and Abram utilizing a perfectly legal, culturally accepted, but deeply human attempt to force a divine promise, and it backfires spectacularly. It generates jealousy, a total abdication of leadership, and outright abuse.
But right in the middle of that human failure, grace intercepts. God intervenes. And notably, he doesn't intervene to scold Abram and Sarai in this chapter. He intervenes to comfort, protect, and elevate the victim of their impatience. He meets Hagar in the dust of her desperation.
Her external circumstances didn't magically resolve. The command was to return to a hostile environment. She was still a servant, Sarai was still her mistress, and the oppressive societal structures remained intact. But her internal reality was entirely transformed. She was no longer just a runaway. She was a woman who had met the God who sees.
And that leads directly to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today as we wrap up. Hagar had to walk right back into the difficult, unyielding wilderness of her everyday life.
But she walked back fundamentally changed because she knew she wasn't invisible.
Exactly. So how does knowing that you are truly seen, whether that is being deeply understood by a trusted friend, recognized for your true worth by a supportive community, or intimately seen by the divine, how does that alter your capacity to walk through the unyielding wilderness of your own life? It's something powerful to chew on as you navigate the days ahead. God bless all the listeners.